Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
My name's Addison, and I'm a senior communication and Spanish double major from Berry College in Rome, Georgia, which is about an hour 15 from Chat. I'm a first-time OSCLGer, and I'm privileged to have this opportunity to come up to Virginia and attend this lovely conference about not such a lovely theme, failure. But last fall, I had the pleasure of taking my first ever class with Dr. Fieldspringer. It was called Gender, Race, and Class in Media. And that was a great class to start with, I think, with Kim. I'd never really had a class like it, nor a professor like her. And we had these readings and discussions that were actually truly enlightening. And we would thoroughly hash out media texts, cultural controversies, theoretical analyses of failures. And to be so real and honest, I didn't know what the term hegemony meant before taking that class, but it became my most used word of 2022. And this course was also one of my first 400 level courses in communication, one of the first times I'd conducted a full-on rhetorical analysis and research paper. And so I was a little anxious for the whole process, and I doubted that I had anything to say, anything of substance to contribute, but here we are, and 1 year later, literally a year ago, I got a time hop flashback from Kim, who commented on my first milestone. This is a really interesting topic. You should consider submitting it to OSCLG. And so now we are here at OSCLG presenting. But yeah, towards the beginning of the semester, Kim urged us to choose a topic that we were interested about. And I had a few ideas, but what I am really, really passionate about are cemeteries. I'm a big fan of cemeteries. I actually had my high school senior photos taken in a cemetery back in Chattanooga. And it wasn't really in a cool or punk rebellious way, not like a cool Halloween photo shoot. It was more, I really enjoy researching ancestry and family history and all that. And so I find cemeteries to be super interesting, how we honor our family histories and the dead and the sites we dedicate to them. And I also just think it's a cool place to reflect and just, it's chill, it's tranquil. And in fact, yesterday, I visited a couple cemeteries here in Norfolk on Princess Anne Street, and it was the Elmwood, Cedar Grove, and West Point cemeteries. I just love visiting cemeteries whenever I'm traveling. And the West Point, that was the cemetery where the first African American to die in the Revolutionary War is buried. So that was really cool. So I also really enjoy researching marginalized cemeteries like that, and I actually directed and edited a 30-minute documentary about a patchwork of all black enslaved cemeteries back in my college town of Rome, and it was nominated for production award and whatnot. Got good views on YouTube, and it was screened to 100 or so people at my school. So it allowed me to explore the black community in Rome, Georgia, and also get a glimpse into how we honor the dead. And most notably, the deteriorating conditions of these black cemeteries demonstrate the white privilege and historic socioeconomic barriers of racism in the South. But yeah, among the people I spoke with was this lovely lady. Her name's Levada Dillard, and I'm so glad I get to shout her out because she's basically my third grandmother. But she is a prominent figure in the Rome black community, and she was actually arrested during the 1963 sit-ins in Rome from Maine High School. And she still calls me a couple times a month, basically like a third grandmother, and she constantly reminds me that the work done in the documentary is not over. So it'll never be over. But yeah, anyways, all my interest in cemeteries culminated into this semester-long project for Kim's class, and it's entitled Marginalization After Death. So my paper, is centered around the unmarked cemeteries on the 1750-acre campus of Central State Hospital, which is a former mental institution in Milledgeville, Georgia. Milledgeville is kind of in the heart of Georgia. It used to be the capital before Atlanta. But before I give you guys a brief elevator pitch of my paper, I'd like to open with a poem that I opened with on there, written by the poet Mike McNellis, called The Ghosts of Central State. So, the state had buried us until our dying day, and so the state buried us in the cold, cold Georgia clay. Numbered mental stakes mark our place of rest. Names were not necessary when burying lunatics. I love that poem. So for the millions of patients and inmates of mental institutions throughout the United States from the late 18th to the 20th century, marginalization continued, this is hinted at the title, not only through life but also in death. And to kind of tie it in with the theme of this conference, they were continuously failed, not just from birth but up until after their passing. But yeah, Central State Hospital, it was opened in 1842, housed nearly 12,000 people at the same time at its peak in the 1960s, which was also the peak of the institutionalization era of intellectual disabilities. And collectively and in total, they buried a whopping 30,000 people on the grounds in Central State Hospital in that almost 2,000-acre campus. And due to the stigmatized nature of intellectual disabilities and people with physical or limited capacity, there was a lot of stigmatization. So due to that stigmatized nature of intellectual disabilities at the time, graves were anonymous and they were unmarked under the guise of privacy and ethics. The hospital claims they kept records of who and where everybody was buried, but most of those files have been lost due to poor maintenance of records and whatnot. So now only a small percentage of names and information from the interred has been recovered, which is very sad. But you know, the hospital, their argument is during this time, families would send their relatives and their children off to be institutionalized and not want to have anything to do with them. So they didn't want to have that tarnish, I guess, on their name. And so they didn't want their family name to be displayed on a gravestone inside a mental institution's campus. But due to that hospital's failure, consequentially, thousands of people's lives are now collectively forgotten, lacking adequate representation that said, hey, I lived here once. I had a soul and a body just like you. And this mistreatment and symbolic annihilation, as I mentioned earlier, of these people didn't just start when they flatlined. For many, it started at birth. So it was a lifelong and after-lifelong event. So, but yeah, that stigmatization of intellectual disabilities led to that rampant spread of institutionalization. And over the decades, the cemetery's condition decayed as institutionalization became less popular. Insufficient funds, management mishaps, and landscaping errors contributed to the loss and the overgrowth of large sections of the cemetery. And there are several different cemeteries throughout the campus. Particularly degraded, which I focus on this in my paper, was the African American cemetery. It was completely segregated. It was off in the woods, and it was actually lost. People forgot it was there after so many generations because a thicket had kind of grown over it. So it was only recently rediscovered, like, oh yeah, there's a cemetery up there, because it was just so run down. And I also mentioned landscaping errors because one day when the property was being mowed, the workers took out all the stakes that marked where people were to mow the grass, and they didn't know what they were, and they just kind of threw them in a pile. So they kind of lost the location of where everybody was, and also if any of those had names, now they didn't know where they were. So that was a big failure, not knowing where your bodies are buried, nor being able to attribute a name or a birthday, death date to anybody. It's kind of scary. But so my paper delves not only into that tragic history, but also focuses a lot on the restoration efforts made by different volunteer groups. One's particularly, it's called the Georgia Consumer Council. And so I analyze how these restoration efforts are interpreted in media, and I reach for these bigger questions like, does coverage of these underprivileged cemeteries and restoration projects actually yield contributive positive results, How can we move forward past such large historic community trauma? Also, with the Black cemetery in particular, is there any white savior complex at play here? So my paper just kind of reaches towards those larger themes. And among the theories and rhetorical tools I utilized throughout the paper was Foucault's idea of the medical gaze, which comes from The Birth of the Clinic, obviously. And that basically critiques how medical professionals dehumanize patients by separating the person's body from the person's person or the person's identity. Additionally, I take other studies of different archaeological grave sites and unmarked cemeteries around the globe. I even analyzed one in France to compare and contrast the characteristics of how the millions of lives lost in institutions have been effectively erased and silenced. And so there's a lot more I could nerd out about, but given the time constraint, I'm going to kind of wrap it up here. But if you are interested in discussing more about this, feel free to approach or connect with me later. And once again, my name is Addison. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.